So this is a fun topic. I looked at this PowerPoint, unfortunately, just a short time before we started, and this is based on a lot of the stuff in this particular PowerPoint is based on a much older article that I wrote years ago, and I would do it much differently today. So I will go through the PowerPoint. At the beginning, I do want to talk a lot about changing practice areas and some of my thoughts about that and reasons to switch practice areas that you should consider if that's something you're interested in. And then at the end of the webinar, I'll just take a quick break. This is not going to be that long of a webinar, but anyway, we will go through the material. And it's actually a very important topical area. To get started, most attorneys end up in the practice area they're in many cases without even choosing it. And you may get into a practice area without making any choice about which practice area you're going to be in. So some examples are if you are in law school during a very good economy and you go to a big law school, you may just find yourself doing corporate related work, even if you're not a good fit for it. You may find yourself doing real estate work if you have something about real estate in your background, or if you look on paper like you might be a good fit for it, or if a law firm just needs people. You might find yourself doing patent law if you're working have some scientific background on your resume. So there's all sorts of ways that people end up in different practice areas. If you go to a smaller law school or a local law school, you may go into a consumer-facing practice area, which could be personal injury or just consumer bankruptcy or tax law. There's all sorts of practice areas that people go into. And so it's crazy the way that people get into different practice areas. And I'm not saying that there's not some sense to it, but it can actually be very dangerous and very bad for a lot of people. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, but this is actually now a very good time for you to be learning about this, because I do think that the economy at the present time is going through some major changes, and all you have to do is watch the news. And just like in the last financial crisis, you had Bernie Madoff and all these sorts of things. Now you have new financial crises with FTX, and then you have 11,000 people laid off Facebook, and Amazon's laying off tens of thousands. The economy is going into a very rough period of time. And because of that, typically what always happens when the economy gets bad is all the attorneys that were hired into large law firms, a lot of them were hired into corporate practice areas. And deal flow slows down. And then when companies slow down, they stop using outside attorneys as much. And so if you're in certain practice areas, especially transactional ones, which include corporate, real estate, because when interest rates get high, then the deal activity slows down. And that's obviously the real estate market. This can have a very profound impact on your career. So you have to say, is it smart to change practice areas right now? Or should I do something else? Am I going to lose my job? All these sorts of issues and thoughts come up for attorneys about their practice area when the economy is bad. Another thing that happens when the economy is good is that everyone wants to go into the practice areas where there is a lot of demand. So there's a lot of demand for corporate and litigators, and always want to go into corporate when the economy is good because they hear about all the success stories there. But the type of practice area that you wind up in is often just a product of the economy at the time. And then in addition to the economy, sometimes it's just the kind of law school you went to, how well you did in law school, and then the geographic market you're looking in. So if you're in a law school in New York, the odds are if you go to a big law firm in New York, you're going to wind up in corporate. But if you're in a big law school in DC, you're probably going to end up in something related to litigation. It just depends really on where you went to school, how you did, and the economy. So the reason I say that the path that can be insane that people end up in the practice areas is you may go into a practice area that you have no interest in, and that is not a good fit for you because of the economy and other factors. And that can often happen to people, and it happens to lots of people. The final thing I would say before I move on with this is that when you are in a practice area and thinking about switching practice areas, a lot of people that try to switch practice areas, not all of them, but the majority of them, when they do switch practice areas, come back to the new practice area, and they often find things that they don't like about that practice area as well. So a lot of times being unhappy practicing law may have more to do with the practice of law than it does the practice area that you're in. Not always, but a lot of times it does. Or it could have to do with a practice setting. So sometimes you may be unhappy in a law firm practice setting, but you might be much happier in an in-house or government or public interest or academic practice setting. The practice area that you're in is not often the problem, it's often the practice setting, or it could be the size firm or the type of firm. Large law firms are typically, there's less client contact and they're more impersonal than smaller firms typically will give you more client contact and maybe be more personal. It just kind of depends. But there's all sorts of different ways to think about your practice, what's making you unhappy and what you don't like about practicing law than the practice area. And a couple final points would be, if you're unhappy in your practice area, many attorneys are unhappy in their practice area just because they're in the process of learning a practice area. Learning a practice area, when you're at a firm and you're learning, a lot of times you will be criticized, felt like you're incompetent and not understanding material and nothing you do is good enough. And you may be working with a certain partner that has very high expectations. And that may make you think that you're not good at what you're doing, when in reality, you might be very good. You're just with a very demanding person. And that has very high standards. And if you learn to rise to those standards, you will eventually be very good. Sometimes being unhappy is just a function of your ego adjusting to being in a law firm and having your work criticized and learning how to become a more effective attorney. It's not often the problem with the practice area. And there's other things I could talk about with practice areas too. I will give you some hints about how to switch practice areas. One thing I will say, if you do go to a recruiting firm to switch practice areas, it's probably not the best thing to do, because even though I certainly make a living placing people, if you have experience in a certain practice area, a well-defined practice area, most law firms are not going to hire you through a recruiting firm if you're trying to switch practice areas, because they will hire people that have experience in one practice area through the recruiter. So if a recruiter is trying to place you and you're a stellar attorney that has a great background, you're at a big firm and you want to go from corporate to litigation, that's just not a good use of anyone's time to work with a recruiter. And the reason is very simple. It's because recruiters are selling essentially people that have a certain skill set. And if you don't have that skill set, just because you are at a big firm and you may have great academics and so forth, there's no reason that a firm is going to hire someone that doesn't have experience in a practice area and wants to switch. It's just they don't use recruiters for that. That's like hiring a law student through a recruiter, and that doesn't happen either. You have to do most of the stuff you have to do on your own. And I'm going to give you some tips about how to do it on your own. Now, is it possible to switch practice areas if you have one specialty and there's a subspecialty within that practice area? Yes. So you can use a recruiter for that. An example would be if you're an M&A attorney and you want to do general corporate, yes, you can use a recruiter. If you're a commercial litigation attorney and you want to go to a firm where you're going to do a mix of product liability and employment litigation, yes, you can use a recruiter for that, because that's the same type of work. What I'm talking about is making a switch from maybe a litigation type practice area to a transactional practice area, transactional to litigation, or just a complete switch, which would be doing litigation to doing all environmental. Those sorts of switches, you can't use a recruiter. And so switching to practice area obviously is something you can do. I will talk a lot about that today. When I get done with this PowerPoint, I will also, when we take questions, I'll open up a Word document and tell you how to do it. But in general, one of the things I just wanted to offer is anytime you want to switch practice areas, meaning you want to do something at another firm that you're doing that's very much different than what you're doing now, you're almost always going to need to move to a firm that's probably not as prestigious as the one you're at, or in a smaller market. And those are two big things to remember. And I can talk more about that in a little bit. And one final point is, if you're trying to switch practice areas, it really has a lot to do with the kind of person you are and your type of what motivates you and where you're coming from as an individual. Certain people enjoy conflict. They enjoy telling other people that they're dumb or poking holes in other people's arguments and arguing and being seen. And those are good jobs for litigators. And there's certain types of litigators, and there's that are very good at that and enjoy it, and there's people that don't. And if you have a personality that's not like that, you may not belong in the litigation practice area, and thinking about doing something else is perfectly fine and switching practice areas. Other people don't like the kind of detail and extremely complex clerical work that a lot of corporate type work involves. And they're just not naturally built for that. And they detest it, and then it's not for them. And that's okay. So maybe there's another kind of work for you, litigation or something else. So there's nothing wrong with changing practice areas and feeling like you need to. But my point is that I covered at the beginning is I think that a lot of people end up switching practice areas or wanting to switch practice areas for reasons that aren't related to the practice area. Many times they're related to their general dislike of practicing law, being just all sorts of different things. Okay, so here's some tips just to change practice areas. This was written a long time ago, and I have a lot of other knowledge that I've since then. Here it says the transaction, a legal practice area can take 1 to 2 years. It can, but you can also do it very quickly. It doesn't matter. You can, one of the things is if you do switch practice areas, this is, you really want to have an understanding of what the practice area you're interested in is. Everyone kind of has this experience with certain types of knowledge that they encounter throughout their lives, and where you will be very interested in something. I don't know what that is for you. I was just, before this call, I was looking at a test in chemistry, I think that my daughter had taken, and it was just perfect. And she's very gifted. And the chemistry is like the last thing in the world I enjoyed doing when I was in high school. And certain people gravitate towards chemistry. Other people with the law are very interested in tax law. So I was someone that really understood what was going on in tax law. I don't know why, but I did. But I didn't understand other practice or other classes in law school as well. So certain practice areas will likely appeal to you. And just looking at a list of practice areas is something that may appeal to you. And you may actually feel a real drive to do employment defense, or be an employed plaintiff's attorney, or to be a personal injury attorney, or to be a tax attorney, or to be a litigator, a commercial litigator, to be a constitution. All sorts of practice areas may appeal to you. And what you should think is a practice area that appeals to you and that's a natural fit for you should be something that would interest you to sit down and read a book on a Friday night. And I hate to say that, but it's really the truth. It should be something that you're naturally motivated to, and where to you, the whole idea of working in that practice area is fun. And it's not work, it's interesting, and it's something that you like. And if you have that sort of enthusiasm when you're looking at the practice area and what those attorneys do, that's a very good sign, because you're going to do well. That's going to come across when people interview you, and you're probably going to do very well in that practice area. Anybody that's successful at anything likes what they do, and they like the subject matter of what they do. So obviously I like this subject matter of recruiting and legal recruiting, and it's good. But if I didn't, I don't know where I'd be. So you need to, whatever you're doing, it needs to appeal to you, and the practice area that you choose needs to appeal to you. And you need to be excited that the more this knowledge unfolds, and the more you learn, and the more you become an authority, the more excited you're going to be. I had an experience years ago where I was talking to an attorney that had become very successful, and I just saw them on the Wall Street Journal yesterday. And this person had, from the time they were a law student, had been keeping a file of cases in this certain practice area. And when they got out of law school, they didn't get a job in that practice area. They got another one, but they kept seeing cutouts and all these, and they just were very interested in it. And because of that, they ended up becoming, eventually working themselves into a position where that's all they did is that practice area, and became a national figure doing it. And so I think that your interest in something is very important. Like, you have to, if you want to switch practice areas and you have a reason for doing it, you have to be interested. It's not just that your practice area is not safe and people aren't hiring, or you don't, I don't know, there's more money in another practice area. It needs to be something that you're interested in, because whatever practice area you want to do, and whatever practice area is interesting to you, you will do well in if you throw yourself into it. It doesn't matter what the practice area is. It can be anything. It doesn't matter. If you like the practice area, you will do well. Some people are very motivated by trust in estates. It's not something that would interest me, but some people are just very interested and they love it, and they relish the idea of sitting down with people and helping them plan their death. These are things that people really enjoy. And so you have to really enjoy what you're doing. I remember when I was in high school, I had this not counselor, but advisor, like a teacher advisor. And he was talking to me about someone in a class for me, I think, or maybe a couple classes that had gone to some Ivy League college. It might have been Harvard or Yale or something. But he was saying that this person got in just because they had this huge passion for studying bugs, which I always thought was very interesting. They studied bugs independently. They went to conferences about them, and very few people are committed to any types of subjects. So this person was able to get into this great school without the best grades and all that because they were motivated by something and became very well known in the field eventually. So the point is that studying and being interested in something really makes a difference, and it should appeal to you. If you see a book in a bookstore about your practice area or something related to it, it should appeal to you. And you should be interested in. I remember I became interested in litigation as a practice area because I read a book by Katie Couric, if you can believe it. She wrote a book called, I think, The Trial Lawyers, and I read it when I was in law school just in the summer. And it was like the most exciting book I ever read. And then I went and did an independent study and did all this stuff and helped teach at tort school. I was very interested in it. The point is that you have to be interested in the practice area that you're in. And then it should appeal to you naturally, and you should really want to do it. And that, I think, is the first thing. And if you have something like that interests you, then maybe switching a practice area does make sense, but it has to appeal to you. I meet people all the time that say they want to do something. They want to do anything but the practice area that they're in. They want to do something, and you have to be motivated at some sort of level to be really good at anything. Because if you're really good with anything, you will seek out information, you will make connections other people won't. And you're talking about your career, and this is something you're going to do presumably for a long time. So if you're going to switch practice areas, you want to make sure that it's something that you're very interested in, because most people in the world are just kicking the can down the road, and that doesn't work. You need to be focused and interested in what you're doing. The next thing is to find a mentor. So if you are interested in a certain practice area and you think you are, and once you've investigated everything, then you need to start talking to people that are interested in that practice area. And what that means is you can do informational interviews with people. You can talk to people that do that type of work. You can go to conferences. You can talk to people that you went to law school with it. You have to find people that do that. Many times you can do that within your own firm. And if you talk to partners in your own firm and they're doing that practice area, and you ask them for work or you volunteer to help them with things, and then they oftentimes will help you. So one of the things you can always do is, if you do it well, is to switch within your own firm. And many times firms will also allow that. You have to be very careful about that. Going and just asking to switch practice areas can be very dangerous, because they essentially have hired you to do one thing. And if you want to do something else, that kind of scares them, because then they need to hire another resource, and they may need to put a resource. It's not always the best thing, but you can certainly do that. But I think the best way to do it first is often to try to get a mentor in another practice area, or talk to them and see if they can give you work and that sort of thing. And a mentor is very helpful. It doesn't even have to be someone that you're currently in your current firm. It could be someone outside your firm. But getting an understanding of your practice area from those sorts of people, and seeing if the things that they talk about, the challenges of their job and the things that they do resonate with you. And so you have to look for people many times in your community and speak with them. And then another thing that you can do too, that I think is helpful, it's not just writing, it's also speaking. But many times if you're able to write for an article or something about the practice area that's interesting to you and submit it somewhere, that can be helpful. It may seem a little odd to you to do that, But again, if you're interested in the practice area, getting involved to some extent and getting out there is going to help you, and because it's going to show an interest. And in order for someone to hire you in a different practice area, it is important many times that you show an interest in it. Networking is similar to getting a mentor. If you are interested in a different practice area, then joining different associations within your bar, talking to other people that do it, meeting friends or making friends with people at other firms that are in that practice area is a great way to do that. And there are a lot of practice areas where I believe that these kind of tips of networking, of studying the practice area and getting involved are very important. One of them, by the way, is entertainment law. I can think of numerous people that I know that became entertainment attorneys and in some cases switched practice areas. The way they did it was they started going to all sorts of events related to entertainment, whether it was entertainment professionals groups or groups of entertainment attorneys. I'm thinking of one guy, it was kind of funny. He was a family law attorney and had a very successful practice, and he started going to all these music law things and then found a mentor, someone that did it, and went and asked some questions and spent time with them, and then studied entertainment related work on his free time. And I think he wrote articles, and which was funny because the guy was not an entertainment attorney. He was, I think, a family law attorney in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles who've been doing it for 15 years. So you can make and the same kind of thing too, by the way, I've seen with people switching to entertainment law and within law firms I've been at, they typically will start asking work for people that have entertainment related work, and then they will start reading entertainment related publication, like a Hollywood Reporter they used to get, and that was just a magazine or like a newspaper, and then going out to networking. So this is how, if you're switching a practice area, and then you go to bar events, you start networking and you get involved with other people doing it, and then you find groups, and then you try to find mentors, and you do all these things, and it can work very well. And then once you're associated with that group, your enthusiasm for that really comes to the surface. Now, I want to contrast what I'm talking about with this entertainment with people that often will try to go into corporate when they're in litigation. And many times they'll just show up and say, I want to be a corporate attorney, or I want to do this. And they don't really understand that in order to make that switch, you need to put on the appearance and network and find people interested and adopt and do all these things that I'm talking about, because anybody can want to do something, but it's the difference between wanting to do something and making it happen. So one thing that you need to do is you need to almost form yourself and put on the appearance of someone that already is that, and be around people that are doing it, learn the way they talk and how they think. And it's just, there's a whole kind of way to do it. And then you can also do CLEs in the practice area. That's not really going to get you very far, but if you're interested in that, then you should definitely do it. I certainly look at courses and different things all the time. I'm very interested in this business and in business as well, and I take courses all the time, and I do that because it's helpful and keeps your knowledge base up. But so you also want to do that if you can in your practice area. You can certainly use Google Alerts and sign up for newsletters and things related to things that are happening in the practice areas, and read news. In most practice areas, there's different bar associations related to it, whether they're national or local, and so that can be helpful. And then you want to learn how the business works. So business is an important component of all practice areas. I was interested in entertainment law, for example, for a long time, but then I wasn't. And the reason I wasn't was because I realized that most of the work is, if you're doing work, most people want to go to work for stars and that sort of thing. And if you do work for celebrities, then a lot of the work that they do for them is very kind of short term. It's not when you work like in a big firm and you're working on huge cases that are generating millions of dollars. You're often working on contracts that are generating a few $1,000s here and a few thousand there. And it's a very difficult way for a lot of people to make a living. It's not to say that they don't, but the type of entertainment law that I was exposed to, it wasn't a good way to make a living from the business side of things. And so I wasn't interested, but some people are. You have to understand the business and how it works, and whether or not it's a good long-term fit for you. And because if you're in a big firm right now, that's a good business. The big firm is a good business, but is a certain practice areas may not necessarily be a good business. So those are things to understand. And then again, the new network is important. This is a very good way to get positions. It's a very good way to switch practice areas. I've known people, a lot of people that have just through networking have managed to switch practice areas many times late in their career. When I say late, I mean with 10 plus years of experience, just by people that they knew, and then those people moved to a new firm and then we're able to connect them to something. So even other friends that are attorneys can often help you into a new position. So there's a network can be very helpful in that regard and for you. And then of course your old network is important as well, but the people that you know there and asking them for advice, and then in your old network is fine as well. And then structure, of course, is important. This is just, it's not that important to what I'm saying, but if you do want to switch practice areas, you have to put consistent time into it, and you have to make sure you have a structure that's going to continually expose you to the ideas of the new practice area, of the search that you need to do, the learning. And so you just kind of fall on your own rock because you're really trying to make a transition. And in order to do that, you need to change as well. That's just kind of an example. So I'm going to talk a little bit right now about some of the, I don't know what exactly this has to do with this article. With the article, it's funny, but I did look at it. I thought it was fun. So I will talk about it in terms of switching practice areas and what type of practice areas you can switch into. And this really does detail a lot of the easier ones to switch into. And I'll talk a little bit about why they're easy and why they're often good choices for people. If you're thinking about switching practice areas, thinking about starting your own firm, whatever you're thinking is great. So family law is a great practice area that you can switch into. I've seen corporate attorneys do it. I've seen tax attorneys do it. I've seen commercial litigators at major law firms do it. I've seen all sorts of people do it. Can be a very profitable practice area. It can involve, it's interesting from the perspective that a lot of it is very confrontational, but it's litigation, but it's also, it can be tax law, it can be trust and estates law, it can be corporate law, it can be every sort of practice area there is. I think a lot of attorneys go into this and set up their own practices and do very well. It doesn't matter where you went to law school, the clients are really not that concerned about it. And it's usually a very good practice here to open up your own practice with, or just to go into. People will spend a lot of money on family law attorneys, and there's just a lot of activity there. We, as a placement firm, it's a very active practice area, but it can be a very good practice area if you're ever thinking about switching practice areas and you want some sort of, people also don't like it because it can be very personal and ugly and all sorts of things, but this is a practice area that a lot of people switch into, often from major law firms. So it's and smaller law firms, and you can really switch into it at almost any time in your career, whether how senior or junior you are. So it's a good practice area. Consumer law is another big one. I don't know why it's such a big practice area. I do know why, but there's definitely a lot of demand for these types of attorneys in this practice area. This is another one that a lot of people go into from big firms and small firms. This could be suing people for suing companies for some sort of act or consumer fraud, all sorts of different related sorts of things. Lemon law is another one of them. We work with lemon law firms, and I never even realized what a big practice area this is. Some of these attorneys make very good livings, as much as attorneys in major law firms as associates. Insurance law tends to be very easy to switch into as well. And these are low-hanging fruit. There's insurance defense is the name of the practice area, but there's also bad faith insurance, and insurance defense firms will hire people often from other practice settings and other practice areas. And that can be, if you're interested in litigation, is another one that can be good. Criminal law is another one that is pretty easy to switch into. These, you can open your own practice doing it, even without a lot of experience defending DUIs and things. And These can be very profitable. It's not only profitable, but it may be something that you're interested in. Generally, it's better to get government experience, I think, prior to doing this, but people do it anyway. So that's another one. Civil rights is another one. This can be another good practice area, something that might be interested in to you to switch into. And these are all the ones that I mentioned, all have very low barriers to entry. A lot of people do that. I know lots of personal injury attorneys that do very well, that have been partners at the largest firms in the country that went and did this. There's a lot of personal injury attorneys out there that do very well. This is what's fun about personal injury is there's different ways of practicing it, but a lot of it is more just about marketing for a lot of them. This is the way they think. It's about marketing, bringing people in. Very few cases go to trial. Many personal injury attorneys will tell you that over 98% of the cases that they bring in settle, which is pretty astonishing. And it's even more astonishing when you consider that the fees that they charge are 40% plus cost. And so it can be a very lucrative practice area. Estate planning is another one that's fairly easy to get into. You can get into estate planning without a lot of formal training and learn it fairly quickly. Now, it is a very advanced practice area, meaning there's some people that are very good at it and there's major firms doing it. But a lot of people can get into the ground floor and develop very sophisticated practices. I talk to estate planning attorneys all the time that have their own practices that are earning them individually with like one or two paralegals and well over $1 million a year. And I run into people like this all the time. And it's a very good practice area. And you can learn it and be self-taught. It's certainly you can take courses, but if you were ever thinking about opening your own practice or going to work for someone and learning a skill and then doing that, this is a very easy one. I like estate planning because it does involve a lot of client contact, but it also, if you're motivated, if you're of mind, thinks like a corporate attorney, then it's also a very good practice area because it tends to be it's more transactional than a lot of other practice areas, and so people like that. And again, I can't tell you, just going through some of these practice areas, we have estate planning, personal injury. Yeah, I can't tell you how many success stories I've seen for people doing family law, for example. I've countless success stories of people that have come from the largest firms and done it, and the smallest firms and done it, and just very good livings doing this. And same thing with consumer law, insurance, criminal law, not as much, but you can certainly do very well doing that. Civil rights, same thing. Personal injury, I know lots of extremely successful people doing this. I don't understand a lot about it, but I know it's a very good practice area for people to be in. Same thing with estate planning. I run into very successful estate planning attorneys all the time that have done that. Bankruptcy is another good one. I don't know as much about switching into that as into a practice area. But I remember I had a girl working for me. She graduated from, I think, UCLA, couldn't find a job. I don't know why. She was good. There was nothing wrong with her, but I just probably wasn't looking hard enough. And so I hired her from UCLA after she'd been graduated for maybe 6 months. And then she worked for us just in our legal department at our company for maybe 6 months and then quit. And then a couple months later, someone forwarded me a link and she'd started her own bankruptcy firm. And then I looked her up a year later and their bankruptcy firm had all these attorneys in it. It was very successful. I had the same thing happen with another guy I hired that worked for me for like maybe a year and then started a personal injury firm. And then I looked that up and it was like a picture of him and 15 people that worked for him and saying he'd gotten $300 or $400 million in settlements and trials. And so these practice areas, I just want everyone to understand when I'm saying you can switch them, regardless of how difficult your career has been to date. I have seen people that you would not think have done that, start very successful practices doing this. I'm thinking of another woman that I know several people that have worked for me that started family law firms. One woman started a very successful firm, I think in Pasadena. I think another one did too. And I don't know if it was in Pasadena, but the West LA. But people I think there's a lot to these practice areas if you're looking to switch, and especially if you're looking to ever start your own firm. Employment law is another one. A lot of people will start employment law practices as plaintiffs' employment attorneys, or sometimes they'll start them as defense attorneys. Employment law is a very interesting practice area because what happens with employment law, and it's actually how, if you believe it or not, Quinn Emanuel started as an employment law firm. And the way it works is if you start an employment law firm, you can take cases for a very low price, meaning you'll, instead of charging $300 an hour, you'll charge the company $150 and then do a good job. And then the more of those you do, then eventually you say, can I have some of your commercial litigation? They give you their commercial litigation. And then you do well with that, and suddenly you're a commercial litigation firm. And then suddenly you have a huge firm. So you can do that. You can also do plaintiffs work. I know a lot of people that do that as plaintiffs and make very good livings. And so that can be a very good practice area. And then business law is, I do know people, it's harder, but I know people that have started their own firms representing lots of small companies and just doing their general corporate work. I met a man maybe, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago. I was meeting him for a dinner for some reason. He was an investment advisor at that point, but he'd been at a firm and started his own and broken off and basically charged a bunch of clients retainers. So he was bringing in, I think, $1.5 million a year in retainers for just going around and helping companies with their basic stuff and tax and those sorts of things. So business law is another good one. So these practice areas, by the way, are just ones that are fun that you can always switch practice areas in. The reason I brought these ones up is because they're kind of practice areas where anybody can switch into them, I believe, do so successfully. And I've seen if you're unhappy in a firm, if you're unhappy in your current practice area, and you're ever thinking about going into a practice area where you can do it on your own, those are good practice areas. Or where you can get a job without experience in those practice areas. Those are all great practice areas. And I've seen countless success stories, including in almost every one of these practice areas, people that worked for me as attorneys going back to the practice of law on their own, starting their own firms and doing that. All to be highly recommended. So I will take a quick break. When I come back, we'll do questions. You can ask questions about switching practice areas. There's certainly a lot more I can talk about related to that. Or you can ask questions about any other questions you may have relevant to your career. All right, so let's get questions. Okay, so the first question, is this recorded so you can watch it again? Yes, it is recorded. We've been experiencing a little bit of delay getting the videos, the recordings of these up because we have a different videographer and we're kind of behind on them, but these are recorded. Yes, and I will email a link to the recorded webinar. I will also try to provide if you remind me the next session, I can provide a link to the PowerPoint as well. Okay, so this is a good question. So the first one is, and there's a lot of questions here, so I appreciate everyone's questions and I'll answer them all. And the more questions everyone has, I'm happy to answer them all because I think this is a really important topic. And I've been watching this for 25 years, so it's fun to talk to people and tell you the things I understand about it. Okay, so here's the question is, can you discuss the challenges of working in real estate law and wanting to move to another state and practicing real estate law? Okay, so I'm assuming there's different types of real estate law. So there's litigation, which is a whole, and I don't think you're a litigator, otherwise you would mention that. And then there's leasing, then there's purchase and sale. There's a bunch of different types of real estate law. Now, one of the things that concerns me right now about real estate law, just as a practice area, and this does tie into a lot of different practice areas, but real estate law does concern me, is when I started recruiting, it was in the late 1990s, and certainly real estate was an active practice area in certain firms, but it was very difficult for people to get positions in a lot of markets. And that was because the interest rates were about where they are now at 7% plus. And so what happens when the interest rates are high is that tends to depress purchase and sale activity, and whether it's residential or commercial, which is commercial rates are even higher than residential. And so people are just not purchasing stuff. And so that slows things down. The other thing that's happening now, if you're reading news, is there's a huge office glut. So all of these companies like Facebook and Twitter and not what Facebook, I guess Twitter is one of them. Yeah. All these companies, Amazon and so forth, are getting rid of a lot of their office space and not using it. So there's a huge glut of places in the market. There's a big trend to work at home. And so I don't think real estate is in great shape at the moment. Those are some of the challenges. And I don't know how long the real estate market will be impacted, but it's a very difficult practice area, I think, in terms of its prognosis for the next year or two, at least. If you do want to continue practicing real estate law, I think you definitely can. And you may be in a large market. One of the things that I talk about on all of these meetings is the different firms you can work at. So the largest firms are your most largest clients with the most money to spend, which you would call like your five. I call the five firms. And this is this thing that I developed. And then these are typically like your Am Law and large firms that represent huge clients. And then they have less money to spend, so you give them like four things. And then when you go down at the bottom here, there's nothing negative about it, it's typically consumers without much money or any money. Or any. So these are more consumer-facing practice areas or things where there's not a lot of money involved. And people, I don't know what I'm doing here. So and then in your three would be mid-sized companies to large, or small companies to medium, with maybe some large with less money, and then these are emerged to small companies. So the point of these rankings is it's nothing negative about these, but it's basically showing that these types of employers will be able to hire different types of people. So what I always recommend, if I was a real estate attorney right now, a 5 would be your firms in the largest cities, and think of huge firms in New York City or in LA or all over the country, but your biggest firms representing huge clients doing real estate work. Same thing with 4. If I wanted to move to another market and I was a real estate attorney working at like a 4 firm, I would probably try to move to a smaller firm like a 3 or even a 2, where there might be a little bit more stability, because what happens in large firms is they can hire a lot of people because of their high salaries, and they can overextend themselves and they become dangerous places to work. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't find a very good firm that has a large institutional clients and a lot of work on constantly, but it just is a much more difficult long-term bet. So if I was moving markets and I was a real estate attorney, I probably would, and I was moving to a smaller market, you're probably going to have to move down in terms of the prestige level, maybe, but there's nothing wrong with that. It's safer to move down to a smaller firm. One piece of advice I would give everyone on this webinar is that if you're in a firm and you feel like the work's slowing down and you think your job is at risk, and that's fine, it's nothing you've caused, and these are all things that are just impacting you, and you can't control them, then one of the smartest things you can often do is either move to a smaller market where you're a big fish in a small pond, or you can also move to a smaller firm within your market. When there are recessions, what tends to happen is firms in smaller markets have lower billing rates. And so a lot of times companies will start to save money, will start sending work to the smaller firms in smaller markets. And that can actually be very smart for you to go to those types of firms. I do recommend, if you're in a dangerous situation, that you could potentially do that. I'll tell this story because I like this story. It's a good story and a bad story, but the story is this. So when I was in 2008, when we had there was a big recession, what happened is we had an office in New York, and then we had an office in Chicago. And the office in Chicago was led by a woman that had been a recruiting coordinator in a big firm. I don't know that she even had a college degree, but she was very smart and nice person, followed directions, and had a bunch of people working for her that were also recruiters, that were attorneys. And then we had an office in Chicago that was led by a very smart attorney, and some other very smart attorneys were working with her. And so what happened is the market just completely in New York imploded in 2008. It was a horrible thing. And so what I said to all of the recruiters in the company was, I said, you have to start working your candidates and getting them out of these really large depressed markets and sending them to smaller markets, because the good candidates will get jobs in smaller markets and the work will be more stable in smaller markets than larger markets. That's just always been the case. But the girls in New York were like, we're New York recruiters. We only work with the biggest firms. All this prestige stuff. And even though there's all these suburbs of New York and upstate New York. And so they continued working only with people trying to get positions at big firms in New York, which was the biggest mistake they could have made. And then the women in Chicago were like, okay, this is what he's saying to do, and this is what we'll do. And so the women in Chicago had their literally their best year ever. They were making placements every week and doing very well all through the recession, because they were working with the same people, but they were just saying, these big markets is just not a good idea. I don't know why it happens in big markets. I think it's because there's just a overpopulation of attorneys, and there's just so many people looking for jobs, and it's just a very hard place to get a job during a recession. And then the women in New York were continually trying to place people in New York, and it was just crazy. And so they went like an entire year with very little income and not doing well, where the women in Chicago did exceptionally well. And the same thing with our recruiters in other parts of the country. And just for whatever reason, we had people in Texas then, and Texas wasn't really that affected through that whole recession. Either was Colorado and mountain states. But the point is that you have to look at, if you're in a position and you're trying to move, you have to be very aware that if you're competing in very markets where there's a lot of layoffs and stuff, it's going to be very difficult for you many times to get a position. And I hate to be so direct about that, but this is something that I've learned over and over again. And I almost feel like it'd be malpractice if I didn't share that with you. Okay, let me see here. Let's see here. Given the competitive nature of large firms, is it possible to find, okay, let me see this question. Is it possible to find partners who are good trainers and teachers and are willing to share their knowledge? Yes, of course it is. All law firms, people there, young lawyers can always find people that are good trainers and willing to share their knowledge. In most cases, the best way for them to share knowledge with you is to do the best work you possibly can for them. And when you do that, they'll respect you and be really and look out for you, I think, and will be willing to share their knowledge. Many times, this is a funny thing to say, but in every firm, there are partners that feel like they're not respected by other partners or associates, and it's just the way it is. And then there's partners that have big, huge egos, and who knows, but there's just different types of people. A lot of times, the people that are going to give you the most knowledge are the people that may not seem as respected by other people, but they will tell you a lot of things and give you a perspective. It may not always be the best perspective, but they will give you perspective, and they will point things out to you about you that are holding you back. Many times what they're doing is I don't know what it's called, it's projecting aspects of themselves, but they'll tell you things that will help you many times that the more powerful partners a lot of times won't find, which I've noticed a lot. But one thing is, whatever your practice area, if you look like you're very interested and very committed to what you do, then people will get behind you and they will help you and they will share knowledge with you. I had an experience once when I was at Quinn Emanuel where I was just really interested in litigation, and I was talking to a partner one day after work late, maybe 8 or 9, about taking depositions. And even though I didn't have a deposition scheduled, he was sharing with me how to take a deposition. And then what was interesting is when I came into work the next day, he'd left me, 2 or 3 voicemails, because they kept cutting off after 5 or 10 minutes, about his advice about how to give a deposition. And even though he'd already talked to me about it for a long time. And I thought that was really nice that he did that. So people will give you, and I respect him and respect him to this day. I still talk to him because of that interest. So if you look like you're very interested in something and you're trying very hard and you look like you're going to stick around, then people will often can give you advice and so forth. Okay, so let's see. When you move to another practice area, you automatically take a pay cut as a first year associate. So first year associates moving practice areas don't always take pay cuts. So what'll happen, I think, right now, if they're, I haven't been reading about a ton of layoffs, but there certainly they will come. When they start coming, what firms will often do is they will lay people off in one practice area, but then be at the same time hiring people in another. So if you're a first year associate and you're hired to do corporate and your firm runs out of corporate work, some people will be able to transition to litigation as first year associates because you can certainly still do the work. Others won't, but that's one thing. But if you do move firms and you have to move to a smaller firm, then many times you will have to take a pay cut. One of the things this is just for young attorneys, one of the things that I think it's very important to understand is the most important aspect of your first 3 to 5 years of practice is having access to. It's actually your whole career, but the most important aspect is having access to work, because when you get out of law school, you're not really trained. You're not trained as an attorney. Like there's nothing you know about the practice of law. Like you're not. So I'm trying to. You're not trained, so you need to be trained, and preferably in your practice area, preferably at the best firm you can be trained at. It doesn't matter if you're at a 1 through 5 firm, but you want to be. The largest firms typically will train you a lot more depth about things and slower than your smaller firms. But the most important thing you can do is have access to work, and then people that are critiquing your work. That's really the whole point. The money shouldn't matter. Now, the money is an ego thing, so people think that money is important, and they need them. You have loans, and you think that you measure your self-worth based on how much money you make. But ideally, really, the most important thing is having access to work, meaning people giving you work, because work does dry up. And if work dries up and you're out of work, it becomes very difficult to get into a firm that's just as good. Many times with that discouragement, it takes a lot of wind out of your sails, and then people are just never feel secure the rest of their career. It's just, there's all sorts of problems with not having access to work. So this is really the number one thing to remember. If there's anything you ever remember from this webinar or from anything that I've ever taught, it's really this: have to have access to work. It's the same thing for partners too, because if partners don't have work, then their career ends. So everybody needs to have access to work. And how do you get access to work? You either create your own work, or you make friends and you ingratiate yourself with people that want to give you work. You make people feel good about giving you work, not bad. And you're a team player. So this is hugely important. It's something I can't stress enough. When you stop getting access to work, what happens is then you start feeling badly about yourself. You feel people will punish you by not giving you access to work if they just don't like you, or you're not pleasant about getting work. If you don't seem excited to get work, if you turn down assignments, all sorts of things. So that you have to have access to work. And people always think they have too much work, they complain, but it's even worse not having access to work. And this is a huge lesson. So I wouldn't really concentrate, if I was you, on your income as much as the access to the work. Now, it may mean going to a smaller firm sometimes, or a firm that it's access to work, I think, is really, in my opinion, the most important thing. So you need to make sure you're doing what you can with that. But yeah, money, but I guess to answer your question, I'm sorry, your question is, when you move to another practice here, you take a huge pay cut. And not always. But if you move to another practice area, what'll often happen is you'll have to take a pay cut, because most firms are not going to, a firm that's as good as where you're at right now is often not going to hire you if you're trying to do something else. I want to answer this question a little bit differently. So why would you have to take why would you take a pay cut if you switch practice areas? So, it's a very good question. Switch practice areas. Or why would you have to? So when firms are hiring you, they're basically asking these questions. Can you do the job? I'll go through them. They're asking 5 questions. Okay. So can you do the job if you're trying to do a new practice area? Many times You might think the answer to that automatically would be no, but probably you can. So if you're doing litigation, you're trying to get into corporate, for example, the odds are if you have the decent IQ and so forth, you can probably do the job. And you're a graduate of law school, that's probably the truth. Now, can you do the job at the level they need you to? Meaning, are you going to be able to step in to a new position and do it the way they want it? And the answer is no. So that's one of the reasons you may have to take a pay cut, because it's basically, there's a ramping up period. It takes, to learn a new practice area, typically to become proficient in a practice area, is 3 to 5 years. So that's why I wrote 3 to 5 years. So proficiency takes 3 to 5 years, meaning you can be given something and you can pretty much figure it out and do anything well enough. It takes 3 to 5 years. Okay, so proficiency takes 3 to 5 years. So you probably can't do the job. Can you be managed? That's a kind of, and again, this is just think about yourself, how you would think about someone if you were hiring them. So if somebody walks in, if your gardener walks in and says, I want to take care of your kids or do something completely different than what he or she's doing, maybe they can do it, but learn to take kids, it's not like hiring an experienced nanny. They're going to need some experience doing this. So that you may not be able to do the job, and there's going to be a ramping up period. And so that's difficult. Now, can you be managed? They don't know, but it does seem odd to them, many firms, odd that you would want to switch. And it's going to bring questions, meaning, is this person, what's wrong? Like, why are they trying to switch? So that's that. And then will you commit and do the job long term? The answer is probably no, because you certainly did not commit. You've proven you'd not committed to the last practice area, to current practice area. So what's to say that you're not likely enough to commit to the new one? So that's been their experience. So that's the other problem. And then do you want the job? You may want it. So everything I spoke about in this webinar was to show firms that you really did want the job. And so if you do things like networking and studying the new practice area, that's probably going to show that you probably want the job. And then do we like you? If you are effectively networking and passionate about it, then yes, they may like you. So these are the challenges that you face when you're looking for a new job. And if the law firm believes, and so most law firms, large law firms, are looking at you through this matrix. Now, they don't say these are the 5 things we're looking for, but this is really what it comes down to in my experience. And this is having worked with tens of thousands of people. These are always the questions that are coming out. And the reasons for rejecting people are always related to these. So this is what you need to do. So if you're looking to switch practice areas, in order to switch practice areas, you're going to have to go to a firm that's going to ignore these things. So they're going to ignore the fact that you may not be able to do the job. You're going to need to ramp up. They're going to need to ignore the fact that you may not commit. And so many times what that means is if you're trying to switch practice areas at a 4 firm, maybe you go to a 3 firm that will take a risk on you because of your qualification. So I can give you lots of examples of people I've worked with like this. So I was working with a guy not too long ago. He went to Harvard Law School and did very well there. It doesn't really matter, but I think he was a former professional athlete or something of some sort, or maybe a really successful college athlete. And just tall guy and just had a lot of presence. But when he came out of law school, he did something like went to work for the Army, or I don't know what it was, but it was something that was not at all related. But because of his background, I was like, okay, I'll work with him. But he'd been working for 3 or 4 years, I think, for the Army, or it was some government type thing, doing something administrative in nature, not that related to the practice law, but it was a practice area. But it wasn't like a traditional law firm practice area, and he wanted to go to a law firm. So I got him a job as a labor and employment firm. It was probably, I would say, a 3, maybe a 3+. And he was like, wow, there's hundreds of people here, and I'm the only one that went to Harvard. What's going on? And I was like, you can't expect any large law firm to hire you because you're essentially switching practice areas, and you're trying to and you're not proven. And these are all the reasons. They don't know if you can do the job. They don't know if you're going to commit and all these things, but they liked him. And so he got into a good firm, and he took a long time to accept the offer. And eventually the firm was, if you don't accept by tomorrow, we're going to withdraw it. And so he accepted. Now he's been there for several years and is doing well. But if you want to switch practice areas, you're going to have to many times look at things from the law firm's point of view and realize you're probably going to need to go to a smaller firm to make that happen, or a firm that's less prestigious, because there's just too much of a risk for them. So I hope that answer helps. Okay, let's see here. Okay, I like this last question. There's a lot of other questions, so I will answer them, but this is a long one, so I'm going to try to answer it. And any other questions anyone has, I'm happy to answer them. These are great questions. These questions are helpful for a lot of people. Okay, I'm currently working on commercial mortgage-backed securities transactions and thinking about transferring to M&A. You mentioned that we should keep an eye on all the updates in the industry. Do you have any suggestions or resources, organizations I could join to keep myself apprised of new trends in M&A? Also, how transferable do you think my experiences are in commercial mortgage-backed securities transactions when transferred to M&A? We focus mostly on mortgage-backed securitization. I feel it really has nothing to do with M&A, but it's more related to real estate. Okay, so if I was doing commercial mortgage-backed securities transactions and thinking about transferring, I don't know why you would want to transfer, but maybe it's because you're worried that it's going to slow down, or maybe you just don't like it very much. There's a lot of, and I don't know how long you've been doing it as well, so those kind of all would be relevant to your question. But I do think that to learn about M&A, there's lots of organizations that do it. Pretty much whatever your practice area is, there's going to be all sorts of organizations that have something to do with it. So you can look up whatever your practice area is and do searches for organizations in that practice area and find it. M&A is a huge practice area. So there's a lot of stuff about that. Now, you raise a good question, transferring to M&A from that practice area. That is what you're talking about doing, is you're talking about transferring from essentially a one corporate real estate type, one transactional practice area to another transactional practice area, which is a lot easier than if you were doing, say, commercial litigation and trying to transfer to M&A. So you're in a transactional practice area, and that's a huge start. And so it's going to be much easier for you to transfer, if you want to transfer from that practice area to essentially another practice area. Now, you have a bunch of options, and I'll talk to you a little bit about how I would go about doing it if I was in your shoes, and how to think about it from more of a strategic standpoint in terms of how law firms work and how a switch would work. My guess is that you're probably at a 4 firm, which I would say would be like an AmLaw 100 or something, a big firm, and you're doing that practice area. So 4 firms would be ones where they would have very discrete, many times, practice areas, meaning they'll have people doing something just like you're doing, commercial mortgage-backed securities, and that's it. So that would be a big firm, and the largest firms do things like that, and they do practice areas that are very specified, because the idea is that attorneys that are specialized can charge more money, and clients get better value and better service, more money per hour. Our clients get better service. And so that's how the law firms think about it. And so they typically, those are going to be in big cities and that sort of thing. So probably at a 4 firm doing. Now, what I would say is there's 5 firms that probably also do that, and 4 firms, but there's 3 firms probably that do the practice area you're in too. But if they do that, when you start getting into smaller firms will mix it up. So they may do securities and M&A. The attorneys literally could do both, securities and M&A, or securities real estate, or M&A and general corporate. They mix things up because they don't have the expertise they don't have the clients that are as large that are demanding that specialization. So if you are working in a market like Palo Alto or New York or Chicago, you may be doing a very discrete practice area. But if you were to go and work at a big firm in, say, Cleveland or Minneapolis, the attorneys might do a bunch of different things, or a smaller firm in one of those markets. They might do a bunch of different things. So your question is, how would I switch over? You have a couple options. The other thing you can do too is you could also go to another firm where you could do that and M&A in other practice areas, because in firms without clients could hire you to do that, and then you could get experience in their general corporate department, which might do a bunch of different things. Instead of just commercial mortgage-backed securities, they might do that and a bunch of different things. So if I was you searching, what I would do is I probably would look for firms where you could sell yourself based on having that experience, but also work in other practice areas as well. So that would mean you could go to a firm potentially in your own market that does different things in your own market, or in a smaller market. In a smaller market, a firm is likely to do different things. Smaller market. Or you could go to a 3 firm or a smaller firms. That's how I would do it. One of the things that's nice about your practice area is there's not a ton of firms that do it, meaning I'm sure you know who all your competitors are. And if you get experience in something like that, you're going to be very marketable probably throughout your whole career, because the more specialized you get, better off it would be. But M&A is also a very good practice area, obviously, and you could certainly switch to that. But anytime you're trying to switch within corporate, it can be difficult to do sometimes if you're trying to go to a firm that's of the same quality, and that's kind of up to you. Most firms that are looking for M&A people are going to want to hire someone that whose primary experience is in M&A, and then they're not going to have to train. Just as they probably would, it would be very difficult for your firm. Your firm would probably be quite unwilling to hire someone to do commercial mortgage-backed securities who's coming from M&A. I hope that answers your question. It doesn't. You're right. It doesn't have really anything to do with M&A. It's a completely different practice area. But that's how I would go about it. Is I would try to find a firm where there's more corporate generalist as opposed to corporate specialist, and then that experience could go in there. And its securitization is related, could be more related to real estate, but there's also other types of securitization. People securitize auto leases and all sorts of things. So you could, that's how I would think about it if I was trying to do it. But I would say that what you're trying to do is more likely to work at a firm that's probably not as good as the one you're at if you're trying to switch practice areas. Okay, I hope that helps. Okay, let's see here. Question, let's see. Okay. This is a fun question. What are some of the less stressful areas of law to practice for a lawyer? What I think is the least stressful attorneys are often practicing in things like trust and estates. I think that's a practice area that doesn't have a lot of stress involved in it for a lot of people, and they like it because there's not always a lot of time pressure to get things done, and the work is often not confrontational because there's just not a lot of pressure. So I think people like that. But typically the practice areas that aren't going to be stressful for you are ones where you have a natural skill and natural ability and where they're interesting to you. And one thing I always try to say to people is that I believe that it's very smart to try to go into practice areas and work where you get excited about doing them, where you want to get up in the morning and do them, where the work is interesting and where you enjoy reading about them and doing them. And the more practice areas like that for you, the better off you're going to be. Let's see here. Okay, so what are the signs that an attorney should consider changing specialties? So I think that if you're thinking about changing specialties, I think that really the idea is that the work itself is not fun. You miss things. You're not just incompetent. You feel incompetent and are incompetent. Around you, seeing everyone is catching on to stuff much faster. Yeah, but you're not interested in it. You feel like avoiding the work. You want to avoid the work. Time doesn't fly fast, meaning you're hoping for it to turn, for the day to end. You do not look for all these sorts of things. Do not look forward to work, and So if you feel this way about what you're doing, you feel like the work isn't fun, you're missing things, you believe you're incompetent, you're not catching on to things other people are doing, catching on to stuff much faster. You want to avoid work, meaning you don't feel like working, you're watching the clock, you're padding time, meaning I'm not saying you're overbilling clients, but maybe you're acting like you're in the office more than you really are working. These are all signs you're probably in the wrong practice area, because you really, whatever you're doing in the practice of law, in any job, by the way, it should be fun and you should be excited by it, and time should go quickly and not slowly. You should be in a position where at the end of the day, you can't believe how much time's gone by and you've had a very good time. So those are all things that I really recommend to people in order to, that you want to be in a position where you feel very engaged by your job. And if you don't feel that way, that's not a good sign. It means that there's something about the practice area that's not appealing to you. So I would think about it just like when you're in, I can remember where I get, there's local community colleges and courses and stuff that send around catalogs and things of their courses. I don't know why they send it to my house, but they do. And so they'll be sitting on the table or something, and I'll pick them up. And I'll always see classes that appeal to me and ones that don't. If a local community college is having a class about genetics, I'm definitely not going to be interested in that. But if they're having one about something related to anything related to human resources and the kind of things that I do for a living, they look extremely interesting. I'm like, I wonder if I can make time to do this. So this is how it should be with a practice area. Like a practice area should appeal to you in that way. And it should be something that you're excited about. And if it's not, that's a bad sign. And you should find another one. And the practice area itself doesn't necessarily need to be that intellectually interesting. It could be types of interactions it sets up. So some people are just very driven to personal injury because of the types of interactions they believe it sets up, or they're driven to employment law or being an employment plaintiff's attorney. It's just different things motivate people in different ways, and that can help them. Okay, let's see here. All right, this is a good question. Thanks for asking this. What time is it? Oh, someone else, what time is the webinar over? It'll be over pretty soon. I'm just going through some questions here. Some of them I've already answered, but I'm looking if there's new questions, but it'll be over in a little bit. Let's see here. Okay, so let me, this person put their name. I'm gonna stop that, sir. But I think I have the question. 1 second. I try not to show people's names. Attorneys are funny because they don't, we want to keep your name. Let's see here. I always try to keep those confidentiality. So I'm a former Division I athlete, but is interested in sports entertainment law and currently working in corporate law and contracts. I heard you speak to entertainment and sports being short-term, lack of work, and not lucrative. What advice would you give to someone trying to switch to that field? Should I stay open to my own agency or go to work with bigger sports or entertainment agencies? Will work drive there as well? Okay, so this is a good question. So everything about the practice of law really deals with, and it's very interesting. So this is what I've discovered after more than 3 decades of being in this field. Everything is about access to money, about access to to money. Like this is how firms operate. Like how much money can a firm will you have access to if you go to a certain firm? So if you go to a firm, your Wachtels and your Sullivan and Cromwells and things like that, like these clients, the 5 firms, clients have do not care. Clients will spend whatever you tell them they need to spend. You tell them they need to spend. Without very little question, with few questions. But I'll have no questions. So this is what happens when you work for the biggest firms. And then in general, more of the same, but much less, but not as much. And then 3, and as you get down to 1, clients extremely cost sensitive. So what happens in things like entertainment law or sports and entertainment law is that the clients are a lot of times individuals. They can be entrepreneurs that own sports teams, or But, and again, sports is a huge business. I'm not poo-pooing it, but a lot of what people are thinking about when they go into these practice areas is they're thinking about representing talent, which means athletes and other people. And athletes, of course, make tens of millions of dollars a year in many cases. But at the same time, the work that they require compared to what a large company requires is much, much different. So 5 firms are trying to get work from Tesla and Amazon and things like that, where 4 firms are doing much more of the same. And then the 3 firms are working for smaller companies and so forth. And 2 is mainly individuals and small local businesses you may work for, will know about. So the point is, when you work in sports and entertainment law or in practice areas like that, you're more often negotiating single contracts. You're doing things that are not as likely to generate massive fees. And for that reason, a lot of sports and entertainment firms would be like 1 or 2 firms, mainly 2, but they represent different types of people and things, and there's not as much money involved. That's not to say you can't make a lot of money doing it, but it's more like piecemeal. If you are working in a large law firm, you have all this work in front of you, and you can pretty much sit down and bill clients at your leisure, and they will pay you. Not all of them, of course, but that's the idea. But when you have sports and entertainment clients, that's what happened. I have done entertainment law. I've worked for famous entertainment attorneys during my career. One of them, George Hedges, had lots of he's no longer alive, but I did a lot of work for him. And the work was always very, don't bill more than a few hours on this, do that. And it was just everything was just very small projects. Whereas when you sit down and you're representing General Motors or something, you just go all out. And a lot of times the work also isn't that sophisticated. So meaning the contracts aren't very complex and the disputes aren't really that complex compared to what you would get in different types of things. So but that's not to say you couldn't do well in it. I'm just telling you the limitations, and going to work for a sports and entertainment agency might be a very smart thing to do, especially if you're a former athlete, and it might be good for you if that's what you want to do. And when I was practicing law, I saw a lot of people do that. At least in the last firm I was at, a couple of people that were former athletes did that. I think one of them now is general counsel of a major basketball team, and another one did something. So it's a good field, and I don't think there's anything wrong with being in it. I'm just telling you how, from the business standpoint, how there's many times access to less money if you're trying to do it in a law firm. And so that's how I would think about it. I would say if this is something you're interested in doing, that I would commit to it and do what you can to be involved and work in an agency. I don't know that working in an agency is going to be similar to, I don't know if you're talking about being an agent or what you're talking about, but that's a different job than practicing law. And you may or may not have the skills for that. Being an agent it can be a much different skill set than being a corporate attorney, because you're dealing with different types of things. So if it was me and I was considering doing something like that, I would probably meet people in the industry first that are doing the kind of work you want to, talk to them, get a sense of what they do, ask them questions, and before you make a move like that, because that's a huge career change, and it could be a very smart career change. I know lots of people that have gone into that. I have one friend right now that just committed to this whole sports field and has done very well. Now he's working for the Saudi Golf League and making huge amounts of money, consulting, or I don't know, he's got some role there, not consulting, he's an employee, but so you can do very well. So I think I would, if I was interested in going into entertainment, or if I was interested in being an agent, I would try to learn more about it first. And I would talk to people before making the switch, because getting into the type of work you're in now is not easy. And my advice too is always to become an expert in corporate law and contracts. You really are going to need 3 to 5 years. Once you have that, you're a pretty good attorney if you're at a law firm, because that 3 to 5 years of experience will teach you how to think and how to do things like an attorney needs to. And that thinking process and contacts that you make will be things you can use later in your career. So I hope that was a good answer for you. I know that's a lot to offer, but I've seen a lot of people do this, and I know the stress you may be having with it. making that decision. Okay. All right, let me see here. This is someone that's a lawyer from another country. I did a paralegal certification. It's still been hard for me to keep my feet in the legal door because I don't have any experience, or someone declines here, overqualified. Please give suggestions. So one thing that I would say that can be very useful is if you are interested in working in anybody that's having a difficult time getting a job, I'll tell you, I shouldn't even say this, but I had an opening for an in-house counsel years ago, and I was getting, and people really like in-house counsel jobs. They will do all sorts of things to get them. They'll call and leave messages. And I was getting great applications of people that wanted to do this job for us, and from major firms, and hundreds of them. And I had the opening and interviewed some people. Then I put it on hold and went to was working at other things. And then one day this woman walked in my office, and she was older. I don't know how old, but I would estimate probably in her late 50s, early 60s, and gave me this and had her resume and said that she really wanted the job, and she'd applied a bunch of times and I hadn't responded. And so long story short, I was very flattered, very easy that she walked in. She was in my office and wanted to meet. And because of that, I ended up hiring her. And she worked for me for several months, and I gave her a bunch of work, and was literally, without a doubt, and I don't say this to be mean, but she had no business practicing law. Was the worst attorney that I've ever encountered in my life, meaning to the extent where she couldn't put together a sentence and stuff. And I was just so working on so many different things, and that nothing that I gave her was done. But the point is that I made a huge mistake there, and I've actually hired very good attorneys. Most of everybody I've hired has been exceptional. I'm not criticizing anybody that's worked for me, but this person was just not a good attorney. But the point is that she was able to get a job with me among someone supposedly like an expert in hiring, among all sorts of other people, because she walked in, really wanted the job, acted like she did. Her resume seemed that, from what I saw in her resume, she looked like she could do the work that I had, which was very simple work. It was just doing acts with law firms or something. It wasn't very complex work, but at the same time, I made a mistake. So if you want to get a job with someone, and many times the best way to do it is if you're just applying and sending out resumes to people and applying and saying, I'm from whatever country and I'm a paralegal and I want to work with you, people aren't going to respond to your resume. Think what you would do if you were in a law firm. Why would they take a chance on you? They have no incentive to do. There's probably much better applicants coming in. But many times if you show up at an employer with your resume, say, I know you have this opening, I'd love to talk to you about it, I can do the job, I work hard, then you will often be hired. And I've hired a lot of people like that. I hired one person one time from, I think he's from the Ukraine. But he came in and said he really wanted a job and he'd work hard and and now he's very successful working for a company that does marketing for law firms. I mean, he makes very good living, $300,000 or $400,000 a year. And he started out working for me at practically minimum wage, maybe a little more than that. But my point is that people can do very well, and will often, if you take a chance on people, will take a chance on you if you show up at an employer's office and you act like you really want the job, and they see you and so forth. I've made that mistake many times, and it can work. And then I had this is one final thing that I thought was very interesting. When I was in law school, I remember one day I was at the first, it was like the first day of school or something, and I walked by there was a admissions office, and then I was going to see some other person. There were all these people sitting outside the admissions office, and I knew the admissions guy because he taught professional responsibility. I'm like, what are all these people doing here? And he said, well, these are all people who are on the wait list, and they come and they sit down and they wait and say, we're going to wait to see if we can get in if people don't show up and stuff. And they do this every year, and this is how many times we fill people off the admission from our wait list. And I was like, wow, that's fascinating. So people would actually show up in the law school, in the admissions office, the day before school started or the day of school started, in case there were openings, and being like, I'm here ready to study and go. I thought it was just fascinating. I guess they're already on the wait list, but sometimes if you want a job, being the one that is the most proactive can work. And I've hired a lot of people to work for me that were from other countries that really wanted to work for me and just showed up in my office. And I've also represented people in the past and got them jobs that did that I normally wouldn't have represented. So being proactive, asking for help, telling people you'll work for them many times for less money or whatever can often work very well. Okay, so let's see. I think that's about it in terms of the questions. Let me see here. It says, will changing a practice area in a short period of time impact your future job applications? No. Once you switch practice areas, that's fine. One thing I do recommend many times, this is just a final piece of advice, and then I'll end this webinar. But one thing that you can do a lot of times, if you're in one practice area and you want to switch practice areas, so say you're doing, I don't know, many times you can just put down the name of the firm and say you're an associate, and then just be very general about what you're doing. So if you want to be a corporate attorney, and you did a little bit of corporate work at your firm, and mainly you did litigation related work, what you can do a lot of times is you just describe the corporate work you did at the beginning. So you would talk about, you'd say when the firm name, firm name, and then dates, firm name, dates, and then you would say associate, and then you might say whatever your title was, then you would say drafted contracts and did all drafted contracts, reviewed corporate bylaws, whatever other things you might have done that are related. And then you would say also worked on litigation matters related to litigation, drafted, litigation, so I don't know, drafted discovery, and this is not progress of litigation, and that sort of thing. So that can be helpful to do things that way. So then you don't just say corporate, you don't say litigation, so you say associate, and then you may talk a little bit about whatever you did. And then if you're applying for a corporate job, that can be, then people see this and are like, oh, what have you done? And then kind of that way. But that's one of the things I recommend if you're trying to switch practice areas. If you have a little bit of experience in the one you're trying to switch over to, you can always describe that many times at the beginning of your experience. And then if your last 2 or 3 jobs before that, or your last jobs, you maybe did litigation, you would just say associate, and you would say firm name, and then associate. And then I'm not telling you to be dishonest, but I'm telling you, and then you just say associate and maybe not say anything. And then, because what happens is you're going to automatically disqualify yourself from jobs if you do it that way. And then when you go into interviews, they'll certainly ask you, but you have to be honest, and you should never ever lie in an interview or on your resume, but you just don't draw a lot of attention to things that are not related to your practice area. Because if people see litigation in every job, then they're just going to be like, oh, this ridiculous to hire this person for a corporate job. If they see you've done some corporate related work in this job, and then you're honest about the fact you've also worked on litigation, you don't always need to talk about all the other experience that you have as well. So that's kind of how I would do it. I think that's about it. So I certainly appreciate everyone's questions today, and it was great talking to everyone. Next week is Wednesday, so I think I'm not sure if that's for Thanksgiving, but we'll be doing a webinar then. And I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.